Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue.
Thank you. Ms. LaViolette, just before we finish talking about the continuum, and this is Exhibit 558, have you ever used this in court before?
Yes, I've used it in family court primarily because there was a perception that there was a flight risk with a father who had dual passports, and he didn't fit into what is commonly seen as a perpetrator. He wasn't like the guy on television or the guy in the movies, but he clearly fit in to somewhere between some of the characteristics of abuse and some of the characteristics of battering. So it was used to explain to the court what that range of behavior could look like.
Well, and when you talk about range of behavior, when you're looking at a potential batterer or a potential abuser, perpetrator, is it possible for them to have characteristics of more than one of these columns?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They can. That's why it's a continuum, because there can be behaviors from different categories that are present in one person.
All right. And ultimately, after you created this continuum, was it ever published anywhere?
It was published in the Journal of Child Custody, which is a peer-reviewed journal that means that other people in your profession are asked to look at it and review it and decide whether it's worthy of publication or not.
So when something's peer-reviewed, does that mean those people who are looking at it, do they have the ability to say, no, it's not worthy?
Yes, they do. In fact, I'm a peer reviewer for the Journal of Child Custody, and sometimes we get an article that we just don't think is up to standard, and you can either recommend that people rewrite it if there are minor changes, or you can recommend that it not be published at all, and so that happens.
Okay. And this morning when we're talking about this continuum, and you're talking about the batterers or the perpetrators, you talk about them having control over their family members or the fear that they can instill in the family. When you talk about family, who are you talking about?
I'm not necessarily talking about family in the standard kind of way, because it can be people who very much care about them. So they don't have to be living with that person. They don't have to be married to that person, but they need to be intimate enough that that person really cares about them.
And is there a correlation in the work that you've done between people who, the type of abuse or the more serious of abuse that can occur with the type of relationship between the abuser and the victim?
Generally speaking, in intimate partner violence, most of the rage is directed at the intimate partner, but it can also be directed at children as well if there are children involved. Otherwise, it tends to be directed at the safest target, and that tends to be the intimate partner, adult partner.
Why is the intimate partner a safe target?
Because the intimate partner is probably not going to tell anybody about it, and the intimate partner has, if they're married, they've made a promise to stay. If they're not married, they've probably made some kind of a commitment in terms of just loving each other. And because people are generally more cautious when there are logical consequences and witnesses, which is why you don't see a lot of people who are perpetrating domestic violence are not acting out at the workplace. Because if they act out at the workplace, there are witnesses and there are logical consequences right away. And when you're at home, there might be the consequence that your partner gets upset with you, but generally it takes a lot longer time before your partner would leave, or there would be a logical consequence like the police coming or something like that. And there are no witnesses other than the people that you're intimate with.
Okay. You talked about intimate partner violence. Is that, I don't know if you've used that term yet, but is that somehow different than domestic violence?
Actually, intimate partner violence is the new terminology because it covers people that aren't married. And when you talk about family violence or domestic violence, sometimes people think you're talking about child abuse as well. So they've kind of called it intimate partner violence now.
Is that the new terminology?
That's the new one, yeah.
Okay. All right. There's a lot to be said about intimate partner violence where one partner will stay. And it rises, I'm sure the answer to that is something long, and I don't want to go there yet, but my question is can you walk us through a domestic violence relationship? I mean, how does it start?
Well, I use this kind of example when I'm doing training because the question I'm still asked the most is why does someone stay in an abusive relationship? So what I try to do is make it something that we can all get, because most of us would fit in this kind of a situation. So I usually walk people through, I ask people to think about the very first time they were in love, the first time they were really seriously involved with somebody. And usually that's late teens, early 20s, in the 20s sometime. And I ask them to think about what that's like for them and where they learned about being in love. I ask them to think about what they saw in their own families, what they've seen on television, what they've seen in the movies, what books they've read. For some of us, we can go back to the radio, what we heard on the radio. So to look at this range of places that we get information. And so I ask people to think about that. And then I ask them to put themselves in their first relationship and what that was like for them. And I tell them, I have a couple theories about relationship, and one of them is that most of us could live with someone who is abusive for about a year, and we could live with them. And if we were in love, we wouldn't notice, because they would be on their best behavior for a period of time. And the energy of new love is bigger than the energy of fear. And for a lot of people who are abusive, they're really coming from a place of fear, even more than rage, and the rage kind of covers that up. So I talk about that a little bit, and then I ask them to think about being in this relationship and spending time with this person and going out on dates and meeting each other's friends and maybe eventually meeting each other's family and having some holidays together. And then this person that you love gets angry at you and gives you the silent treatment for a day or two. And you're kind of wondering what's going on. And you're a little nervous. And then that person calls you back like nothing's happened and you're fine. And then you go a little further into the relationship and the person gets angry at you and calls you some names that you find really offensive and you're upset with. And then I ask people, do you think you would leave at this point when a person calls you these names that you don't like? What do you think you would do? Do you think you would leave? And most people say no. And so I ask them to go a little further in the relationship. And now you decide that you're really serious about each other, so you're spending more time together. And as you're spending more time together, some other things happen. And you get in an argument, and this argument's a little different than the other arguments that you've had. And during this argument, your partner picks up something that you care about and throws it into the wall and breaks it. And I ask people, would you leave now? And most people say no. And by the way, it hasn't mattered what group I've spoken to. I speak to all kinds of groups. I speak to church groups and professional organizations and probation officers and therapists, and it doesn't seem to matter. It's pretty consistent.
Okay.
And then I go a little further, and I say, now you've been together, and maybe you've been together about a year and a half or two, and maybe you decide you're going to live together, or maybe you decide that you're just going to keep seeing each other, and you're really tight with each other. And you have an argument this time that's different than any of the other arguments that you've had. And in this argument, your partner slaps you across the face. Now, you're very involved in this relationship, and you love this person. Do you think you're going to stop loving and liking somebody because they hit you? And most people say no, that is not true for them. And they think about getting angry, and they get upset. And I said, how do you feel when somebody does that to you? And people are upset, and most people believe that in a relationship they should be treated well, that they shouldn't be hitting or being hit, that sort of thing. But they also have a clash of values at the very beginning of that relationship. And the clash of values is, I shouldn't be mistreated, but I should be a forgiving human being. I should be a compassionate human being. I should be an empathetic human being. I should stand behind somebody through thick and thin, which a lot of us believe. If we've made any promises in the relationship, we think about those promises and commitments we've made in the relationship. And what winds up happening is those things tend to weigh more than the thing that says, the value that says I shouldn't be mistreated.
So
and
is that, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
is that the ultimate then clash that this person, the victim, for lack of a better term, is that the ultimate, what they're going through, is the feelings of being treated poorly versus being the good person who forgives?
There's that clash very early on, and it's confusing, I think, for any human being, because we all, I believe, come up with the belief that we should be good human beings, and we have standards for that. And those standards are important, those beliefs are important, and I think define who we are. I think that they're significant to us. And so you've got this clash of, different beliefs that are coming together at that point. But there may be more on the being a good person than there are on protecting yourself.
And so when you're having this clash of between these two feelings, is that something that is, in your experience, keeping people staying in the relationship?
It does, particularly at the beginning, because you believe that there's a possibility of change. And there's a concept that Kate Muldery coined back in the 80s called learned hopefulness.
What is that?
Excuse me?
What is that?
Okay. Well, there was a term called learned helplessness that was a psychological kind of experiment. And people thought that victims, and we call them survivors too, that stay in relationship because they feel helpless. They feel like it doesn't matter what they do, that doesn't change what happens to them. So there is that. But one of my colleagues did a really significant piece of research, Ola Barnett, on battered women, and found that the two major reasons they stayed was hope and fear. And that hope was really big. That between episodes, you have time to regroup, you have time to fall back in love with that person or care about that person, your anger goes away, and you have an opportunity to believe that things are going to change. And when that happens, you develop a pattern of hope. And I think what's interesting for me is that that's a good thing for most of us. Hope keeps us, if we're in a position where we've just lost our job, it keeps us in a position to think, well, I'll get another job and I'll be able to support my family, I'll be able to do this and that. So it's a good thing. But in an abusive relationship, it winds up backfiring to a certain degree because it keeps people kind of stuck.
Okay, and you mentioned fear, the other part of the
yeah,
research?
And fear takes a longer time usually to develop.
Okay. All right. And so you were walking us through where we get to the relationship with, and after all this time now, the person has slapped the other partner.
Yeah.
And in most of your teachings and speaking, and in your experience, are people telling you commonly that they wouldn't leave?
They most commonly tell me they wouldn't leave. And people who are in positions that seem powerful, like probation officers and that sort of thing, I've had people come up to me after so many of my speaking engagements. They come up and they say, I don't want anybody to know this. Can I talk to you? And I either give them my card so they can call, or we go in another area and talk, because there's a lot of shame attached to being a woman or a man who has money, who has the ability to leave and doesn't leave, because they're not looking at the emotional reasons that people don't leave.
Well, that brings up a good point. So if somebody has the financial ability to leave, does that mean they're going to leave necessarily?
Not at all. When I worked at the shelter, we saw a lot more women who were, didn't have money and didn't have resources. They might not have had family around to stay with. They may not have had the money to stay in a hotel. And so because there's not a lot of bed space in any given city, you have to sort of sift through people's issues and really prioritize who you're going to take into the shelter. So when women had resources, we might plug them into counseling or something like that, but maybe not take them into the shelter.
But in your experience, did you see women who had resources who would stay?
Right. What would happen is, in the shelter, I saw people with limited resources. When I went out into private practice, I started seeing people with resources and finding that there were a lot of reasons that people stayed that didn't involve finances.
What about couples with children? If there's no children, because we often hear that children is a reason to stay, whether it's right or wrong. So what about couples who don't have children?
Couples that don't have children still have the emotional bond with each other, because that's right, the most significant adult relationship we have is with our intimate partners. And so that is significant. And we also have belief systems that tend to be a little different for men and women around this, because women tend to still believe that if the relationship fails, they fail. So there's a old piece of research, and I don't even know who did it. It was something that I heard at a substance abuse conference, and I see it as sort of analogous with domestic violence, that women who live with male substance abusers tend to stay in those relationships longer than men who live with female substance abusers, that the men are able to pull away faster than the women. And that tends to still be true based on, kind of societal attitude.
Okay. All right. We started with you walking us through a relationship, a domestic violence relationship. Is that how far you get when you talk about it?
No, I go further than that. I usually go to a place where people are more abused. And I also ask people to think about this. For instance, what would happen if you were in a relationship and you had religious beliefs that said that divorce was wrong, or that you should turn the other cheek and forgive, and that you had a spiritual community that really supported you staying in the relationship? Or what would happen if you were an undocumented immigrant and you had a green card that was dependent on the person who hurt you, or their green card was dependent on you? What would you do? How far would that go? What would happen if you were a community that was marginalized and were afraid to interact with the criminal justice system?
What do you mean?
A community that has bad experiences with the criminal justice system and would be less likely maybe to make contact.
Okay.
What if you were gay or lesbian and had to worry about outing yourself or your partner? And so I take a lot of things that come at people from the outside. What if you're poor and you don't have the money? I always think about one of the first women who came to our shelter, who actually, I think she saved for 6 months unmonitored change to be able to pay for herself and her children to come on the bus from Los Angeles to Long Beach to get into the shelter. So there are all these different kinds of scenarios you can look at and different reasons that make it difficult for people to leave.
Did you, in your experience, have you found, you talked about religion, have you found that to be a big factor in why people don't leave?
I have absolutely found it to be a big factor. There's a wonderful little book called Keeping the Faith by Marie Fortune, who is a woman, a female minister, and also one by Reverend Al Miles, that both talk about the religious community and domestic violence. And I have one of my first clients in private practice was a woman who came from a community where when she talked about leaving her spouse, was told that she was damning her children's souls and her soul to hell. And she was afraid to leave because of that. She sort of weighed these two, staying in the relationship or damning her soul to hell. And her husband was a probation officer and a deacon in the church. And it wasn't until he choked her in front of the kids that she went to her minister herself and didn't just go to the women's group. And she was talking to her minister, and she was talking as if she was talking about someone else. She was pretty detached from what had happened, because people tend to detach when they're traumatized. And she pulled down her turtleneck, and she had marks around her neck, and talked about being choked into unconsciousness. And it was then her minister supported her and really told her to leave. And that's when she actually felt that she could. And I found that with numbers of people in religious communities, that they need the support of that religious community to be able to leave.
And so in that woman's case, did it take the actual proof of physical abuse to get permission?
It did in that particular case, yes. It doesn't always, but it did in that case.
Well, and in your experience, do you often see women who ever have proof of physical abuse?
No. A lot of women have no proof of physical abuse because they haven't reported. When I'm working in family law cases, primarily, you very seldom have evidence because most people don't make police reports. Most people don't, when they go to the doctor. In fact, I had a client a couple of years ago whose boyfriend took her to the hospital because he'd hit her in the head and she had a concussion. And when there's mandatory reporting, when there's an injury, and so when the doctor said to her, I'm going to have to take a report, and left the room, she left the hospital. And that sort of thing happens frequently, where you're not wanting to get your partner in trouble, so you don't make the report, you don't tell anybody, you don't, and you lie about what happened in a medical report. So if you go to the doctor and you've got, you have to have stitches, you say that you fell.
All right. So when you're describing a typical what you might see in a domestic violence relationship, the progression of it, what does isolation have to do with it?
Well, because you're not talking to your friends and family. And by the way, I've heard people say, well, if you have supportive friends and family, you can talk to them. Oftentimes that's not true, because your supportive friends and family might want you to make a decision that you're not ready to leave. They want you to leave, or they want you to, force the person into therapy, or they want you to make a police report, and you're not ready to do it. So the less you talk to other people, the more isolated you get. So it's not necessarily that the perpetrator is intending to isolate you, but that you feel that you can't talk to people about what's going on in your life, and so you don't.
All right. And what happens to these women, what happens to their self-esteem when they're progressing through a relationship like this?
Well, over time, what generally happens is they're crossing their own bottom lines. So things that they believe shouldn't happen to them are happening to them. Things they said, this will never happen to me. If this happened to me, I would do this or that. And I think about that. Most of us sort of establish bottom lines when we're in junior high school, I think. And those bottom lines, and I think sort of universally with men and women, we have bottom lines about infidelity. That if somebody's unfaithful, we're going to do this or that, or we'd never put up with this or that. But if you read Cosmo and Red Book and some of those things, you find out that lots of people put up with infidelity. And so we cross our bottom lines. With people who are abused, every time they cross their bottom line, it's like another place where they feel terrible about themselves. So as their bottom lines get crossed and they feel worse about themselves, their apprehension is also going up. And
apprehension of what? Their fear, right?
Yes.
Fear about what?
Fear about what's happening in the relationship. And most of the time, by the way, they don't say they're afraid. When I interview people who are victims of domestic violence, they repeatedly say they're not afraid. And so I ask them, do you get afraid when the person's angry? And then they say yes. But they're not universally afraid unless it's really progressed to a place where the abuse is happening frequently, where the person is so isolated, that sort of thing.
And what does it do? What does it add to a domestic violence relationship when you have one partner with such low self-esteem? If it's continuing to lower, what does that do to the relationship that, as far as domestic violence is concerned?
Well, here's the thing. Most people get in a relationship and they're attracted to the person where they are. And that's true for people who are abusive as well. So as your self-esteem goes down, you become another person. And usually the person who is mistreating you stops respecting you at all as well. So it is easier to mistreat you. The more your bottom lines sort of collapse, the more I disrespect you, the more I feel justified in being able to hurt you.
So as an example of a bottom line, we might start with that a person would never let another call them names, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
Right? Would most people think that that's something they wouldn't allow?
I think most people don't like to be called names.
Okay, so if that's a bottom line, but as you described the relationship and everything that you're putting into this relationship and the time involved and the love that you have for this person, is that something that people allow that bottom line to be crossed by that point?
Yes, and the other thing that's happening is that the longer you're together, the more investment you have in that relationship. And depending, I mean, some people buy things together, some people take trips together. You go on vacations and you have pictures of those trips. That's a very bonding kind of situation. You buy things together. That's a very bonding kind of situation. You're making more of an in-depth commitment to that partner.
Okay, so what about, is there such thing called victim blame?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Victim blame was actually a term coined by Wolfgang, who was a criminologist in the 50s. And what he was looking at was why victims tend to be flaky. And what he meant was, sometimes they won't show up in court. Sometimes they won't return calls by, the attorneys who are trying to get information. They won't do interviews, or they change their description of somebody, or they change what they said initially. And he found that we tend to blame victims for their own victimization. And the more, and so if I'm not a victim and you're robbed, and I say, well, gee, you didn't lock your door, so I can blame you for that. I can say, well, she or he didn't lock their door, so it's not going to happen to me. It sort of alleviates my fear, because I can lock my door and now I'm not going to get victimized. But it doesn't help victims much. And we find that victims do that. And I use an example. I usually ask people when I'm speaking, has anybody in the room ever been robbed or had their house or car broken into? And there's always at least a few people in LA that have, that's for sure. So I ask them about that. And I ask them, what did the police say when they came out? And they will ask if the door's locked or whatever. And I say, well, the police have to determine the penal code also. But your friends don't. And what do your friends ask you? Well, your friends ask you, is your door locked? Do you have a security system? Did you leave any windows open? That sort of thing. And if you tell your friends that you left your windows open, what do? They go, well, of course, that person, you've seduced that innocent person into your house to steal your best things. And I think people go there, and it's that subtlety of blaming victims that we hold them accountable.
I was going to say, when you talk about subtlety, so it's not as though they're saying, well, it's your fault that you got robbed because you left your door open. Is it more subtle, the way that they ask you questions about your door being open? It
could be more subtle. It could be, depending on your friendship, it could be not subtle at all, but it can also be that that it could be that somebody just shrugs their shoulders or just, looks at you a particular way. so that what you know is you you wouldn't have gotten mugged if you weren't walking out in that bad neighborhood, or that sort of thing.
And how does that apply to a domestic violence relationship?
What most of us in the field have commonly said is that the more intimate the victimization, the more blame is attached to the victim. So, for instance, in sexual assault, we tend to blame the victim. In domestic violence, we blame the victim.
Okay, tell me what you mean with the sexual assault blaming the victim.
We look at provocation, particularly in domestic violence. In sexual assault, we might look at the way somebody's dressed, or who they're hanging out with, or they were drinking, or whatever. We, use that.
In other words, that the person put themselves in that situation?
Yes.
Okay.
In domestic violence, there's a lot of times the issue of provocation. People will say, well, you shouldn't have said this, or you shouldn't have done this, and you're provoking the person. So there's some attachment. There's this cause and effect attachment that if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have done this back to you, kind of thing.
So as an example, if a person, if the abusive partner is jealous and the other partner knows that the abusive partner is jealous, are we talking about blame then if the other partner mentions that she went out with someone else, with her friends, knowing that the abusive partner is going to get upset?
That could be seen as it depends on who's looking at it. I mean, I don't see it as provocation,
right,
but someone who's abusive might see it as provocation.
So the abusive person is the one who would say, well, look what you made me do?
Yes.
You told me about this?
I always remember, too, the teachers that I worked with who, he was in my program, but he had been in the program for a while, and his wife wanted a session with him. And they both agreed on what happened in the session. And what happened was that he spent a lot of time on his computer, and she would get upset about it. So she walked by him on a Sunday night and said, I don't know why you're playing with your computer. I wish you'd come up and spend some time with me. So he shut his computer down, and he went up to spend time with her. And she looked at him and said, what are you doing up here? You like to spend all that time with your computer. Why don't you go down and play with your computer? And I thought, well, that would irritate me if somebody did that to me. I'd understand being irritated at that. The problem is that he went on and on berating her over and over again, telling her what a terrible person she was, what a terrible wife she was, that nobody liked her at school, that she was a lousy teacher, and just berated her. So in domestic violence, the punishment doesn't really fit the crime.
Okay. Does that also have to do with the batterers externalizing blame?
Yes, that's about externalizing the blame. That's about blaming the other person. And one of the things I ask him is, when would it be okay for your wife to get angry at you? And he said, never. And I said, what happens when she gets angry? Well, it feels like a commentary on his whole person. It's not like she's just mad at him for playing with the computer. It's like calling him, in his eyes, an awful human being, because his self-esteem isn't very good, or her self-esteem, depending on who's being abusive. Their self-esteem isn't very good either. You can't keep hurting people you love and feel good about it.
Is that something that you find in treating men who have been perpetrators of abuse, that about their self-esteem, that it's low? Yeah,
and they may not appear that way at all. They may be very successful, they may be very charismatic, they may have positions of power on the outside, but it's more how you feel on the inside. And it's more how you feel in that intimate situation. Very powerful anywhere else, but in that intimate situation, you can still feel powerless. Remember, one of the psychologists I went to hear speak, John Jolliffe, and he said, I climb those icicles that melt, I climb them, I rock climb, I rappel off mountains, I skydive. I'm doing all that to prepare for the scariest thing in my life, which is a relationship.
What is behavioral self-blame? Is that what we're talking about?
Behavioral self-blame would be, you didn't lock your windows, so I lock your windows. You change your behavior.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part, what you said. You like what?
It's like I didn't lock my windows.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's like I change what I do. I change what I do. I don't smart mouth you, or I don't get angry back, or if it's something like, locking my windows, I lock my windows. I may blame myself for being victimized. It's not just the outside that blames you. You tend to blame yourself too. I hear people all the time who've gotten robbed, who think, or have gotten mugged, who are blaming themselves, who are saying, "What's wrong with me? I can't believe I was that stupid. I left my door unlocked, or I left the keys in my car," that kind of thing. So people feel that way. They blame themselves. So behavioral self-blame is an easier self-blame to deal with, because all I have to do is change my behavior, and when I change my behavior, I start feeling okay again. I think, okay, I've got this one solved.
Do you mean changing your own behavior versus changing your partner's behavior?
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So it's easier if a person is blaming themselves for getting into this horrible fight where they're being attacked by words and emotional abuse, basically. Is it easier to blame themselves sometimes because they know if I change, maybe if I just didn't provoke them, then it won't happen again?
Yeah.
Is that what victims do?
If they're early enough on, they usually will blame themselves but feel like they can change it. And that's the hope. Okay. The hope is you can change it. The belief is you can change it. And by the way, the perpetrator of domestic violence usually believes they can stop it as well.
That he can stop
behaving
himself.
that way. Yeah, stop behaving that way.
Okay. And that's, you said, to do with the hope? I guess on both sides then.
Yes.
The hope of the man and hope of the woman.
Yeah. And so that's behavioral self-blame. There's another kind of self-blame that's called characterological self-blame.
What is that?
Characterological self-blame is when you stop blaming your behavior and start blaming yourself. So you might say, what did I do to provoke it? But then you say, if I'm really a good person, why am I being treated this way? Maybe I'm not such a good person. Or if I'm smart, if I'm right, why do I stay in this? So you can blame yourself for staying, you can blame yourself for leaving, you can blame yourself for what's being done to you, because you start to believe that there's something wrong with you, and that's why it's happening.
And when in the progression of a domestic violence relationship does this characterological self-blame happen?
Well, it usually happens after the behavioral self-blame, but once again, there's no magic number with that either.
Okay. And what does that do ultimately to someone who starts to blame themselves, their own character? What does that do to them and their ability to leave?
It makes it very difficult to leave because you don't even think you're worthy. You don't think you're worthy. And I think the other part that's tough is that when you blame yourself, it's harder to ask for help because you're so ashamed. What it does is add to the shame and humiliation. And shame and humiliation will keep people stuck.
In the same place?
Yeah.
Okay. We talked a little bit when we were talking with the continuum. We talked about the monopolization of perception, and you had mentioned something about a precursor to the hostage syndrome.
Right.
What is that? Well,
the hostage syndrome was named after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, and there was a bank robbery. Tellers were held hostage over a period of time, and over this period of time, they developed some characteristics. And later, I think it was 2 out of the 3 tellers testified in behalf of the hostage takers, and they found this to be true in skyjacking, and they found it to be true for men and women both, that they sort of fell into these categories where they started identifying with the aggressor. So they're looking at the precursors, and I use that sometimes when I'm doing assessments. The precursors to the hostage syndrome are, the first one is that you have to perceive a threat to your physical or emotional well-being. So you have to believe that there's a threat. And the second thing is you have to believe that the person who makes that threat or is implying that threat can carry it out. The third thing is the perception of kindness on the part of the perpetrator. Now, if you're dealing with a stranger hostage situation, it can be simply the absence of violence. For instance, people generally at the beginning of a hostage, well, I can't say generally, but at the beginning of the hostage situation, maybe, have guns held on them. They might be threatened. They might be kept apart. They may be physically mishandled, all kinds of things. And then over time, the relationship sort of stabilizes. And what you see is people are allowed to go to the restroom, or they're allowed to talk to each other, things like that. So hostages in stranger situations can see the absence of violence as kindness, the perception of kindness. So what happens is because of the isolation and the fear, their perceptions get skewed. Now the fourth precursor is the monopolization of perception, which I went over this morning, but it's really looking at the fact that when you're in a situation and you're terrified and you're afraid that somebody's really going to hurt you and you're isolated, but you hope you can get out of it, that your focus is on the people that have the power. And so the monopolization of perception. And the fifth thing is the perceived inability to escape. Now, in a stranger hostage situation, that can be true because most people, even in that situation, don't plan their escape. They perceive that they cannot escape, even in stranger situations. But in an intimate situation, there's that perception that you can't get out. That if you leave, if there are children involved, for instance, you might not be able to get out because you're going to have custody and exchanges and that sort of thing. But the perception is that you can't leave. And those are the precursors. And by the way, the perception of kindness is absolutely not just a perception in an abusive relationship, because people who are abusive are also kind. And they can be very kind to the person and very caring for the person, which is part of the conundrum, and it's part of what keeps people in that relationship, is that it's not just a perception of kindness, there really is kindness.
Okay. Well, and so how you talked about these precursors, and how does it apply to a domestic violence relationship? And I know we just discussed about the perception of kindness, but how do the other ones, the perceived threat of physical violence, the belief that the person can actually perpetrate the violence?
Well, it's not just a perception of physical violence, it's also a perception of emotional violence.
Okay.
So there's a perception that your emotional well-being's at stake. And so somebody can do that by repeatedly telling people that they're going to leave them or putting them down or whatever that is. So it doesn't have to be just physical. But if it's physical, then you have more than a perception, you have the accuracy of that perception. And if the person has done it to you, then that person is capable of doing it. So the person who makes the threat is capable of making the threat. And between episodes, there's kindness. There's sort of, you can go on vacation together, you can have good times with each other, you can enjoy things in common. You can have evenings where you're just sitting and watching TV together, or enjoying your other family members, or having parties, or whatever. So there is real kindness and bonding kinds of things that are going on in that relationship.
And what does that do to a victim's ability to leave when you have these periods of kindness and real bonding?
Well, it makes it really difficult to leave, because that's what you hope. You hope that it will stay like that. You hope that the relationship is going to remain connected in that way. And your belief is, I think it can be. I think we can keep it like this. I mean, I have this evidence that we've just had this period of time, and we're doing well, and it looks good, and so you're hopeful again, and you're seeing that person as they were when you fell in love with them, or when you developed that love for them. You're seeing them in that way at that time, until the relationship has gone on long enough where you stop believing that it's going to get better.
You stop the hope?
You stop the hope. And that can Depends on the person, how long that takes.
Okay, you know, my next question of how long. Okay. What is chronic apprehension?
Chronic apprehension was actually a term coined in the substance abuse movement, but it's once again something I think applies to domestic violence. And it was coined by Jael Greenleaf. And what she said was that people who are substance abusers get a break. They party, they drink or use, they act out, they get support from the people they're acting out with. For a period of time, they get support from their families. But the people who live with substance abusers never get a break because they live in chronic apprehension of the next episode. And I think that applies very well. It's a good analogy for domestic violence because after a period of time, you stop feeling like you have a break. You're emotionally tired. And that's what happens to people in relationships where there's repeated episodes, is that you get emotionally tired. And as your resistance goes down, you begin to believe or wonder when the shoe is going to fall.
So even though you might be experiencing this time of calm in the relationship with a person who's under chronic apprehension, are they always tense? Are they always waiting for the next episode so they're not able to have that relaxation?
By the time they're chronically apprehensive,
Mm-hmm.
they are tense a lot of the time. But there's a buildup with any of these things. So there's a buildup of that. You don't have chronic apprehension until you get it, whenever that is. But you begin to develop that apprehension because you begin to believe that this is going to happen again.
Okay, and I guess is that the important part to know when we talk about the steps of how a relationship like this can be formed? Where you're asking people, when he first calls you a name, would you leave? And things like that. Is that the importance of how a relationship is formed, that it doesn't start immediately? In other words, on the first date you go out, if he doesn't if he hits you, what are the chances the person is going to leave on the first date?
Pretty good.
Okay. So is that something that you look at then with your patients, basically, with the length of time? Well, I guess not always the length of time, but the buildup of that relationship. You
do look at the buildup of the relationship because the relationship generally is more gradual, and there's a period of time where things look good, and there's a period of time where the perpetrator of domestic violence is not as afraid because that energy from new love is bigger than the energy of that fear. And so it takes a while for the relationship to stabilize and the energy of new love to sort of come down and the fear to come up.
Okay. Can we talk about the cycle of violence?
Sure.
And that seems to be a term that is out there. Is there a definition for it, or what is it?
The cycle of violence is a term that was coined by Lenore Walker. She is probably the godmother of the domestic violence movement. She wrote one of the first books, and it was the first book to really reach national acclaim, and it was called The Battered Woman. And she wrote it in 1979. And she describes the cycle of violence. And the cycle of violence is basically a tension-building phase, an episode, and a honeymoon phase. Okay. So that what happens is there's tension, it builds, there's an incident, whether that incident is emotional, whether that incident is physical, whether that incident is verbal. That happens, and then there's the honeymoon. And the honeymoon phase is where they make up. There's that rekindled hope again. There's that belief that things will change. We used to say people bring flowers or gifts during that period of time. Now, the difference is that some people never get a honeymoon, depending, or that the honeymoon phase sort of diminishes over time, and then what happens is you get the tension building in the episode, but you don't get the honeymoon. You don't get the remorse. You don't get the gifts. You don't get the apologies over time.
Okay. And when you talk about these phases, is there is there a timeline that can you guess at all, or give us an idea? I mean, when you talk about tension building, are you talking about 2 minutes of tension because we're arguing, then the episode, and then honeymoon for the next 5 minutes? Is it something like that, or longer?
There's no magic number with that either. I mean, depending on the relationship and maybe how many prior relationships have been abusive and that sort of thing, depending on the relationship, you could have a long tension building phase. You could have, and I think most of us who've been in long-term relationships know about tension building, because we can have periods in that relationship where things are tough and there's a tension that builds. And so you can look at that, the cycle of violence, and you can sort of say, well, gee, that happens in my relationship because we've had this tension, and then we get angry, we have an argument, and then we make up. It's just the cycle of violence includes abusive behavior, and it's different. And so relationships can be cyclical, but what we're really looking at is that this goes on over time. There is a diminishing of being, sorry. There is an escalation generally in what the incidents look like. And so there's not a time that you can actually say, because it depends on the relationship. Now, there are relationships that are really, really horrific, and that can be, you can have a tension building phase, and you can have incidents every week. Some people have incidents several times a week, but most people get a little better break than that.
So you're saying that even in healthy relationships, you can see this cycle?
Well, what you can see is not the cycle of violence.
Okay.
You see a cyclical nature, which is, we have tension, and maybe we don't have the money to pay the bills this month. So there's tension. And I don't like the way you spend it, and you don't like the way I spend it. So we build up, and we have an argument with each other about that, and then we make up, and we figure out how to solve the problem. That's the difference.
Okay. Well, and the tension, and when you say the episode, in a healthy relationship, the episode is just an argument?
The episode's an argument, and the episode's just conflict that hopefully gets resolved. You know?
But in a violent or domestic violence type relationship, that episode would be different then, I guess.
The episode would be different because it would be abusive in some way.
Okay.
And then what you would have is the person making up, maybe, or for a period of time anyway. And but there wouldn't really be a resolution that happened, because it would repeat itself. So what we tend to say, or what we used to say, was the cycle of violence escalates over time in intensity and frequency. And that doesn't happen in a healthy relationship where you learn how to manage conflict.
Okay. Because in a healthy relationship, is that conflict resolved?
It can be resolved, or it can go on, but you don't do the same thing with the information because you're not coming from the same place.
Okay. Okay. Is there a difference in your practice in counseling men and women? Is there a difference between men and women's anger? Sorry. Actually, what I want to talk about first is fear. Let's talk fear first. Is there a difference between the way men and women fear?
There tends to be a difference in the way men and women fear. There's a piece of research that was done in, I think, the late 80s by Pat Rosé and Kim Mizrahi, where they looked at the numbers of behaviors that women do in terms of safety precautions every day. For instance, not walking out maybe alone at night, having your keys out, maybe looking in your car first, maybe restricting your behavior based on where you're going. For some people, they won't get in an elevator alone because you're told basically not to. That's a self-defense kind of thing that they talk to people about. And men usually don't do that in the same way. But most women, by the time they're in their 30s, have had some kind of exchange with a man where they feel one down. And so they know they're physically vulnerable in that way. The other thing is that women tend to develop or get vicarious trauma over time. And it's something you live with. It's something you walk around and you don't think about during the day. I don't think about taking my keys out but I do. I don't think about looking, I do go out with people at night. I don't go out by myself, in particular walking at night without someone else around. And so we tend to take more precautions, and people do that, parents do that with their children. Usually parents who have boys and girls tend to be a little more cautious of what happens and give their girls and boys different advice in terms of going out at night with, and that sort of thing. So the other thing that happens with women a lot is that there are a lot of television shows on and a lot of movies where women are being stalked, or 48 Hours Mystery, Dateline, Lifetime Channel, a lot of places where you'll see domestic violence, or you'll see somebody who looks like they've been great all their lives, and then all of a sudden there's a divorce or a breakup, and this person goes crazy and hurts their partner. So I believe that we take that information in too, and that we're not immune from it. And then once we take it in, if somebody does something that is frightening, we get more frightened by it. It's not that there aren't abused men, because there are, but it's more difficult to physically abuse a man because men tend to feel like they still have control. If I was coming at you and hitting you, you might feel like you could grab my arms and stop me in a way that I might not feel like I could do with you, unless I had an equalizer, So if I had some sort of a weapon, that would be maybe the way that you would be afraid. But you wouldn't be afraid of me probably in other ways, unless I made a viable threat to you or something like that. So it's not that men can't be battered, it's that it takes a little bit more because women tend to be afraid more quickly. The research, the latest research, looks at what happens in a heterosexual relationship when a man hits a woman and a woman hits a man. And the response tends to be, if a woman hits a man, that the man tends to laugh it off or be angry at her. And if a woman is hit by a man, that she tends to be humiliated and afraid. So the psychological response tends to be different as well.
Well, you mentioned vicarious trauma. Do you mean that's because of what women see on these channels?
Yeah, it's because of what people see. It's what people read. It's if they're reading, murder mysteries, they're reading, they're seeing things on television, and a lot of things, and a lot of the movies that are out too involve stalking women, involve, rape. They involve a lot of crimes against women. And so women do have a certain amount of vicarious trauma when they see that. And if somebody scares them, then they tend to get scared more rapidly. And you can also be scared for a period of time. I've had numbers of clients who have had things happen, like somebody try to get in their house after them. And when they walk back, into that situation, even months later, they're still afraid. If they came in on a certain specific evening and it was, they were walking into the house at that evening and it was dark out, that when they walked in, they would show behaviors where they looked around, where they made sure their keys were out, that sort of thing.
Okay. What about anger? Is there a difference between how men and women are viewed when they're angry? Yeah, and this is something else I do in my workshops. I will ask, when we're talking about gender and anger and that sort of thing, when are women praised for their anger? And I ask men and women that. And generally what I get is never, or in defense of your children. And that's true. And I ask them, what do people call angry women?
And I think you can probably guess, and I don't need to say it, because there is a perception that angry women tend to be judged more harshly than angry men. In the same way that men are judged more harshly for other emotions, maybe they show that they're feeling bad, or they look like they're sad, or they're depressed. They may be judged harshly on those issues too, but women tend to be judged harshly in regard to anger and assertiveness.
So how does that fit into a domestic violence relationship?
Well, in a certain way, you're crossing a cultural norm to be angry, but it's more how you're judged or perceived when you are maybe out of that relationship, or if you are in the relationship and you wind up saying something that isn't very nice to your partner or whatever. Nobody knows why you're saying it, but you sound angry, you look angry. It's not an emotion that, it's not like women don't get angry. It's just that they tend to be less direct with it, more sort of this way.
Okay. Are you aware of any studies that have been done with regard to the difference in men and women's brains?
Well, actually, there's a study that just came out with Daniel Amen. I watched Dr. Oz, so he was on Dr. Oz, and he did the largest gender-based study on the brain, and it was 46,000 brain scans.
Let me interrupt you for a second. I know you said that you saw it on Dr. Oz, but is this somebody, Dr. Amen, is this someone that you know or have researched other than seeing him on TV?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay.
Dr. Amen is somebody who's, he's controversial. What he does is he does brain scans on people who have been violent and people who have been using drugs and that sort of thing, and he compares them with a normal brain. And he shows areas of the brain that light up or areas of the brain that are deficient and that sort of thing. And he does that comparison. So he compared men and women's brains, and he found that
or expertise.
it's a touch.
May continue.
Ms. Violet, in your experience, have you seen with the women that you have treated, have you noticed them to be empathetic?
Yes, I've noticed them to be empathetic. In fact, one of the things we used to say at the shelter was they over-empathized.
Okay. And is that something in particular that you've noticed with women?
Yes, I've noticed that with women, although I'm sure that had I worked with some men who were battered, I would notice empathy with them too. But you tend to notice it with women, and you tend to notice that when they get really upset, and there's been an incident, that once they have time to have a little recovery period, they tend to feel for their partners for at least a period of time and sympathize with them. As I said, when I started at the shelter, the women in the shelter would say to me, you know, our partners have been abused as children, and we understand that. And so when we feel bad for them, and we know that they're acting this way because of how they were treated when they were children. So
women having empathy, how does that play into a domestic violence relationship?
Well, it is one of the factors that can keep somebody in a relationship for a longer period of time, because you keep understanding why that person is doing what they're doing, and you sort of dismiss how you feel to look at how they feel. And so it can keep you stuck.
Keep you from leaving?
Keep you from leaving.
And are you aware of any studies other than just because you saw something on Dr. Oz? Have you actually read through studies that talk about women's empathy?
No, I have not.
Okay. Are you aware of a study with regard to empathy and brain scans?
I am, but it's a study that Dr. Amen did.
Yes. Oh, right. Okay. And with regard to Dr. Ahman, you didn't partake in that study, right?
No, I did not.
Okay, and brain scans aren't your specialty.
No, they're not.
Okay. However, are you able to understand what Dr. Ahman did?
I'm able to understand what he reported.
Okay.
That I think everybody would understand what he reported.
All right. And did he report with regard to women and empathy?
He did. He reported that women's brains.
Objection. Again, Foundation Daubert.
Approach, please.
We were talking about women and how you've noticed women have empathy, which can cause problems for them in their relationships if they're in an abusive relationship. What about the men that you treat in the groups that you have, your men groups? Do you have a goal for them?
I have, besides their goals for themselves, one of the goals I have is to try to change belief systems, because if you don't change the belief, the behavior change doesn't stick as long, and it just takes longer to change beliefs, like beliefs about using aggressions or belief about themselves, those beliefs about what the world is like for them, So I work hard to change the belief about themselves and the belief about using aggression to solve problems.
And do you work with empathy with the men that you work with?
Yes, we do a lot of empathy work with the men, and I gave an example this morning of one of the exercises that we do, but I think about, for a lot of the men, that once they can identify with their own victimization and how they were, mistreated as children, most of them, that it is easier then to make the leap to understand what it's like for someone else. And it's harder. The way I see empathy move generally in group is that first people feel bad for what happened to them. They feel bad about their lives and how their lives are looking. And then they identify with the other men in the program, and they start to feel bad for them. And the place that is easier to get people, even very violent people, to identify is if they have children. It's easier to move through because they tend to empathize with their children. And the last place that they tend to empathize is with their adult partner. And so we're moving in the direction of being able to empathize with the adult partner. But sometimes we have to use other things. And one of the things, and I think about one of the young men in gangs that we worked with, and he had a daughter, and we asked him what he would like a relationship for his daughter to look like, to get him to start thinking about what he would tolerate with his own daughter and how he treated his own wife.
So is that the way, is that how you try and build empathy with the men in your group? By talking about situations close to them, but not them specifically?
No, I talk about situations with them specifically and situations that aren't about them specifically. Sometimes it's easier to empathize with someone else, but it's easier for them to empathize with themselves when they were children, which is why, I sometimes ask them to think about when they were children, to the empathy that they might have for themselves as children. I remember one of the men was talking about his little brother and him, and they were aggravating the heck out of their dad. Their mother was at the market, and their father took a knife and chased them. And they were running away, and he was trying to protect his little brother, and he was pushing his little brother under a bed, and his dad was doing this with a knife, and the mother came home, and the knife is placed back in his waistband, and nobody says anything about what happened. And the mother doesn't know what happened, but the little boys don't talk about it. And this was a man in his 40s, and as he's telling this story, he feels so emotionally about it, he starts to cry and talk about how afraid he was. And it's that ability to see not only that you can feel things so much longer from when they actually happen, and that you can still have feelings about something that happened to you, that you can still be traumatized by what happened to you, and that so he notices the long-term effects. So when he wants his partner to forgive him, he's got more understanding that it might take his partner longer than he wants it to take, but that he also sees what it's like for him. And then you can say to somebody, well, how do you think it feels for the people in your life when you treat them badly? What do you think it feels like for them? But you give people a chance to really get into their own feelings. You don't ram anything down their throats.
Well, along those lines, let me give you a hypothetical, okay?
Right.
So let's say you have a man who's in your group, and he's talking to you about his childhood, okay? In his childhood, this, as a boy, he had extreme neglect from his parents. At times, this boy was homeless, didn't have a place to live. At times that because he was homeless, he was unable to clean himself or have good clothes, and he would get made fun of at school. At times, he knows that his parents were drug addicts, so he had to deal with that. At times, he would know that he would see or hear about violence between his dad to his mom and his mom to his dad. Somebody growing up in a family situation like this, even if he doesn't see everything, but he's part of this family, what do you expect for that man now that he's a man in your group? How is that person, what type of things do you see then as a man treating him?
Well, you can see a lot of things because there are variables that can help him along the way. But if you're making an assumption that there's no intervention and...
Let's assume there's no intervention. Let's assume that he does not have an adult to count on at a young age.
It's very difficult for a child who grows up like that not to have a number of issues in relationship, because children who grow up in abusive families tend to have a lot of feelings of powerlessness. They tend to have some...
Not answering the question, lack of foundation. This was not an abusive family mentioned.
May we approach?
You may approach.
Ms. Lilet, a child who grows up in an environment like that, who is neglected, who can't bathe all the time, who has parents who are violent to each other, who have parents who are drug addicts, would you consider that abusive?
Yes,
is that an abusive family environment?
It's an abusive family environment.
Okay, so I know you just mentioned abusive. So even though if that child necessarily wasn't hit, do you consider this type of environment for a child to grow up in, is that abusive?
It's very abusive.
Okay, so now back to what you would see with a man who were you coming. What do you expect this child to do when he grows up? How does this child deal with what he lived with as a child?
There's something that happens based on the personality of the child and how they take it in. It's whether they blame themselves for what happened. It's whether they feel like there's any way out for them. But what they've learned is a lot of negative coping skills. What they've learned, if you think about what someone learns, and I think about that, I love my parents and I think they were terrific parents. But even when you have terrific parents, sometimes you say, if I have kids, I'm not going to do exactly what my parents did, or there's this thing I'm not going to do that my parents did. And when your back's against the wall and you get upset with your kids, sometimes you wind up channeling the very thing you said you weren't going to say. That some of those things like, because I said so, because, the things that we say sometimes as parents. And when someone has learned to be fearful, because I don't think you can live in a drug-addicted family with people who are violent and not be fearful. You learn to be fearful. You go into your adult life, and where that plays out, it may not play out in your professional life in the same way. In your professional life, you might be okay because you're not challenged emotionally at the same kind of level that you are as in an intimate relationship.
So what do you mean professionally speaking? That person can have
You
a
can
good
be
profession?
successful in your job. You can have a good job. But where you tend to be tested the way you were, or not exactly the way you were, but emotionally, is in your intimate relationship. So what I hear from the men that I work with is they get in a situation with their partner and they're thrown back to that powerlessness that they had when they were kids, and they don't know what to do with it. And so they act to stop that powerlessness. And a way to stop powerlessness is to get bigger and more powerful, either verbally, emotionally, physically, than that other person who they see as making them feel powerless. And the other thing I think that's really important to look at with children is that kids don't have cognitive ability to explain what's happening to them. They don't have the language to say what's happening, and they don't have the life experience. So they're left, kids are pretty feeling beings. They're left with the feelings. And the feelings are what come up when they're in an adult relationship and they feel powerless.
Does having this type of traumatic childhood, does it affect somebody when they're young, like say up to 6 or 7 years old, versus if they were a teenager when it started to happen?
There are things that happen to older kids that can be tolerated a lot better than when they're little, because older kids have the ability to have friendships. Maybe they've had a solid childhood until they're older. And so they've had this period where they've had consistency, they've had a good life, they've had people they can count on, and then they have something traumatic happen in their teenagers, but they have more of an ability to handle it, where little kids, may not. For instance, family that came into the shelter with 5 children under the age of 6, the infant was suffering failure to thrive based on what was going on in the family. All of these children were little. All of these children had full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder and would hide under beds when any adult came in the room. It didn't matter if you were male or female. They were afraid of adults, and they were very hypervigilant, and it took them a little while to be able to be comfortable with even walking, being able to walk in the room with them. So things that are tolerated by teenagers may be very hard to tolerate for a small child.
And so a child who grows up like this, who has this type of childhood when they're young, and they grow up, do they learn how to deal with their relationships without intervention? Do they have a specific way of how they deal with relationships because of what they learned when they were a child?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was specific necessarily, but I would say that they would not have the skills to deal with an intimate relationship because they didn't learn the skills to deal with an intimate relationship. I mean, most of us probably haven't seen our parents fight a lot. Some parents will go behind closed doors and they'll have their arguments and whatever. But if your parents acted out a lot in front of you, you're shaken up in a different way than when you don't see that. If you see loving affection between your parents and it's consistent, you see that that's how you treat somebody in a loving relationship. I always remember my dad coming home from work and...
Stand.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. What are you familiar with the term chronic combat readiness?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Chronic combat readiness is a term that was used in an article by Bruce Perry, who does a lot of work with children who have committed violent crimes or children who've grown up in abuse. And what he says is that if you live in an abusive household, that what you grow up with is the kind of situation you're living basically in a war zone. And if you live in a war zone, you have to be hypervigilant. You have to see the threat in things, because a lot of these kids grow up and they see things as threatening that the rest of us wouldn't. They see a look or a tone or whatever that we might be unaffected by that affects them in a way. So chronic combat readiness is like the notion of living your life in a combat zone. If you grow up in a violent family, and if you grow up from childhood in a violent family, and you have a number of years in that violent family, then you're flooded with stress hormones. You're in fight versus flight a lot of the time, which means you're not operating from your cortex as much. You're operating from your reptilian brain. You're operating from a place where the blood's rushing to your extremities, and you're ready to fight. And kids do a lot of things in that situation. I mean, I would suspect a lot of the people I've worked with who bullied people came from violent families.
Okay. And the men that you've worked with in all the years that you've done this, do you have an idea of percentage of these men that you've worked with who have come from traumatic childhoods or abusive childhood families?
My experience has been that almost everybody I've worked with has come from some sort of violent situation. And that could have been in foster care, they could have been with their parents, they could have been with their primary caregivers, and it could also be exacerbated by living in a violent neighborhood. But the research was showing something like 60 to 70%, but that's because most of the research was done before people really understood that they lived in violence. In other words, they would say, well, that happened to me because I needed to be disciplined. So, of course I had to be beaten because I did something to deserve it. And so they didn't define it as violence. And it wasn't until after they understood violence a little better. So I would say it's much closer to, we're not supposed to say 100% to anything, so I won't say 100%, but it's closer to that. And it depends, once again, on the degree to which somebody acts out in their own intimate relationship. The worst kinds of violence tend to be perpetrated by the people who've lived in the worst kinds of environments and grown up in the worst kinds of environments.
Okay. Oh, Judge, this is good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will take the afternoon recess. Please be back in the designated area at 3:15. Please remember the admonition, you are excused. You may step down. We are at recess.